When a massive cruise liner capsized at sea, it was front-page news everywhere. After 10 years, it was still resting on the underwater rocks where it had become trapped, and it appeared to have been utterly abandoned. Mike and Jeff, two young divers, made the decision to go inside and take a look around. Yet they had no idea that the room would contain such a surprise for them. For as soon as Jeff and Mike boarded the cruise ship, they were startled by a piercing scream that came from a distance. Mike took a look at the rusted and aged door. He knew the scream had come from within the room. Yet with his flashlight, Jeff quickly noticed a sizable crowbar laying on the ground. He knew he just had a single opportunity to get this lock open, so he leaned back and banged the crowbar down into the lock as hard as he could. Mike yanked the door open with lightning speed after the loud bang that resounded throughout the ship and caused the lock to fall to the floor. When they discovered what was inside, they were in utter shock. They now understood the significance of the screaming. They knew they had to get in touch with the police right away. But what precisely did the divers find when investigating the cruise ship? Why did the police need to get involved, and where did this strange crying come from? But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Although Jeff and Mike were aware that they should not be anywhere near the cruise ship that had partially sunk, they were unconcerned about it. They were eager to begin their investigation as soon as they came across it. In the early morning hours, the teen scuba divers set out after determining that no one would be able to stop them. The ship didn't appear to be very robust, and it was anyone's guess what they might have discovered on the interior. It was possible that it would be quite hazardous, and there was no way that they could make it back to the beach in time if something were to happen to one of them while they were out there. But Jeff didn't listen. Already, he was seeking for a means to get into the building. A portion of the upper deck was submerged in the water because the ship was leaning to one side, so that they could climb up upon it and search for a door. However, they had to proceed with great caution. Jeff gave Mike one last glance before securing their boat to a railing on the cruise and leaving. Yet Mike did nothing more than sigh and shake his head in response. He had no intention of going inside, but when he saw Jeff climbing up the deck, he realized that he couldn't just leave him there by himself and went inside. After that, he drew a big breath and proceeded in pursuit of Jeff. He should have known better back then, because that was a terrible plan. They were able to detect the foreboding. The only sounds that could be heard were the creaking of the metal framing and the sound of the water lapping against the bottom of the tank. During their exploration of the derelict cruise ship, Jeff and Mike stumbled upon a number of chambers, each of which exuded a distinct sense of foreboding. They were fortunate that not all of the rooms were secured, as some of the doors were locked. They entered the grand and spacious main hall first, which had high ceilings all around and a huge staircase leading up to the top decks. However, the room was dark, filthy, and covered in dust, and the furniture was covered in spider webs. After that, they proceeded on to the cabins, which consisted of modest rooms with either 2 or 4 beds depending on the size of the room. On the other hand, none of the beds had been made, and mold and mildew had discolored the sheets. Its peculiar sound was suddenly heard by Jeff and Mike while they were strolling through the ship's halls, which were otherwise deserted. "Have you been listening to that?" Mike uttered the words with a voice that was shaking. But Jeff did not appear to have a face. After a short while, Jeff expressed curiosity in exploring the ship's lowest levels deeper below deck. There was a narrow staircase leading to their objective, but it was absolutely dark. As they continued to descend, the cacophony gradually got louder as everyone pulled out their phones and used the spotlights to help them find their way. Mike's degree of concern grew as they moved deeper and deeper and deeper inside the ship. Even if something terrible occurred to them, he was aware that they would never be able to return. His mind raced with frightening ideas as he peered over the corroded and wet walls of the ship. By doing that, what precisely had he gotten himself into? After a short distance of walking, they eventually reached their destination. Mike then noticed something after that. A tiny handle that could be used to open the door was located in the center of the wall. "Use there," he said, pointing. "The door is visible." The door was jammed, so Jeff grabbed the doorknob and yanked as hard as he could to open it. He put his ear to the door and listened carefully from there. He moved next to Mike and did the same, pressing his ear to the door, saying, "There is no question that the sound is emanating from within this space. I'm not sure how we're going to get in, but I can hear it." They were startled when all of a sudden, they heard something that nearly caused their hearts to stop beating. They could hear muffled noises of men arguing with one another as they approached the ship in a boat, and the boat was getting closer. They were conscious of the urgency of their situation. They quickly made their way back to the stairwell, but as they were ready to begin climbing them, they heard a set of rumbling footsteps coming from below. To avoid being noticed, they quickly spun around, pulled out their flashlights, and crouched under the stairwell. They held their breath in expectation as the males drew nearer and nearer. As they descended the metal ladder, their loud footsteps filled the ship. 3 men came down the stairs and went straight to the closed door as they were being observed from where they were standing. When the men opened the door, Mike was able to observe what was happening inside. The murmured wails suddenly become much louder. "Shit," he said under his breath. "We have to get out of here as soon as possible, you said." Jeff gave him a worrisome look as he glanced at him with a concerned expression on his face. "But what did you observe, Mike? Who was there exactly in that room?" But Mike didn't say anything. The scream sounded as though it had been made by a female. "It is necessary for us to assist her." Mike let out a sigh as he realized that Jeff had been correct, but things have taken a decided turn for the worse just now. Mike and Jeff were outnumbered by those individuals, and not only that, but those men were far larger and stronger than Mike and Jeff. Mike also observed that one of them was carrying a gun, which made an already difficult situation considerably more difficult. They made the decision to call the police, but they were aware that it might be some time before the officers came. Hence, Mike collected up all of his bravery and agreed with Jeff that they should peek behind the closed door to see what the men were doing. They cautiously stood up and made their way toward the exit, while paying close attention to the men's conversation as they went. A solitary man quickly left the room and made his way to the upper level as Mike and Jeff hastily withdrew to their hiding place below the staircase. They watched from the shadows. Mike swallowed hard at the thought of coming face to face with the man's gun after catching a glimpse of it concealed in his belt. They watched as the sound of the man's footsteps gradually faded away. Jeff said, "We need to distract the man who is searching for us upstairs while also luring that other man out of the room, which was the current situation. But how are we going to accomplish that? There's just the two of you," as Mike replied to the question. "Simply take your cues from me." It appeared that Jeff had a great deal of faith in his strategy. But Mike was not yet completely convinced. Jeff looked around him in the total darkness. When Jeff held up a sizable rock for Mike to examine, Mike eventually recognized what he was looking for after some initial misunderstanding. Mike was about to respond when Jeff put his finger to his mouth and threw the rock at the stairwell. But to reach stairwell, so cutting him off. The entire ship shook when a loud blast was heard. Jeff quickly retreated into the shadows as Mike's eyes opened in surprise. The man who had been left behind in the room dashed out the door and headed in the direction of the stairs. "Derek," he yelled out in anger, "I'm in possession of them." While the man was running up the stairs, Jeff and Mike waited until they could no longer hear the sound of his footfall. Mike and Jeff emerged from the darkness and made a dash for the room as soon as they could only make out the muffled sounds of footsteps. Jeff pushed open the heavy door and entered the building. But just as Mike was about to follow suit, he heard the other men coming back up from the basement. Mike was at a loss for what action to take and froze up. In the end, he was able to conceal himself behind something just in time for the soldiers to come back. One of the men said to the other, "I really thought I had them, Derek." The response that Derek provided was, "I told you to stay inside the room with her. You idiot, I am locking you inside with her. And I will come back for you once I have found the intruders. I am locking you inside with her." On it, Mike's first thought was, "I hope Jeff was able to hide." Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh lock before locking the door behind him and his partner. After that, he returned to the upper floor and attached the keys to the clip on his belt. After some time of waiting, Mike was unsure of what to do next when all of a sudden, a loud noise came from inside the chamber, which it sounded as though someone was changing the furniture in the room. But why would they do that? Mike had no idea what was going on until all of a sudden he did. They were engaged in combat. Michael sped up his listening by placing his ear close to the door. There was a clear physical altercation going on between Jeff and the other man, and he could also hear a woman crying, although it seemed as though she had something stuck in her mouth. Mike's body was flooded with adrenaline, and the only thing he could focus on was getting his close friend out of danger. Without pausing for thought, he dashed up the stairs and immediately began calling out for Derek. "Derek? Where have you been, chum?" Mike heard heavy footfall coming his way, and before he knew it, he was standing face to face with Derek, who appeared to be really upset about something. Michael greeted everyone with a slightly less assured "hi there." Derek didn't say a word as he methodically approached Mike while keeping his hand near his weapon. So Derek replied after some time had passed, "Are you the one who has been skulking around this ship? You have absolutely no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Do you know that?" Mike was so shaken up by Derek's frightening presence that he almost threw up. However, Mike was also aware that Derek's belt-mounted keys were the only method to release Jeff from the chamber. Mike was unsure of how he had managed to accomplish what he had. He dealt with it without thinking because of how rapidly it all happened. Derek was on the ground unconscious. Yet all of a sudden he had the keys in his hand. Because Mike was pressed for time, he dashed down the steps and unlocked the door as quickly as he could. The last thing he expected to see was Jeff proudly standing over the unconscious body of the other man, but he couldn't have been more incorrect. When he opened the door, he was greeted by the furious face of the other man who was inside. This was a poor choice. Mike had completed his search of the room in a matter of seconds. He was aware of where Jeff was lying, who was seated in the middle of the room, and that he was about to be punched in the face by a man who was almost twice his size, but he was still able to defuse the situation in some way. He walked up to the entrance and confidently stood there. He greeted everyone with a cool "Hello there, your partner Derek is knocked out upstairs," the voice said. but it had no effect on the man in any way. Mike didn't appear to be concerned despite the fact that the man's expression was menacing. When he suddenly went down, he was preparing to swing at Mike, who had suddenly fallen to the ground. As the man fell, he disclosed to everyone that Jeff was standing behind him holding the crowbar. He had risen from the ground as Mike stood facing the other man, and without Mike's knowledge, he had given him a blow to the head. Both of the men were unconscious at this point, but they still needed to move quickly. But they might start to stir at any moment. Mike and Jeff went straight for the woman. She was chained to a chair against her will and restrained, the duct tape covering her mouth. And as Jeff had removed the duct tape from her face in a gentle manner, she instantly screamed, "Please, hurry. Where can I find the exit?" Her hands were untied by Mike, and her legs were untied by Jeff. They were some ways away, but they still heard the police sirens. They assisted the woman in standing because she was too frail to do so on her own, and then the three of them made their way back to the boats together. They placed the woman in their own boat, and Jeff grabbed some of the remaining rope to bound the other men together. When the police did finally arrive, they were completely taken aback by the scene they had been summoned to. They were really taken aback by what they observed. They entered the building at a breakneck pace and detained the two men. They were successful in getting the woman to a safe location, but Mike and Jeff were required to accompany them to the police station. Jeff and Mike were questioned at the police station, and they were required to provide an account of everything that had taken place. They weren't supposed to be on the ship in the first place, so they were scared that the police would arrest them for it. However, the police reacted in a way that was totally different from what they had anticipated, and they were relieved. Both Jeff and Mike are commended for their bravery, so they are not arrested by the authorities. It was later discovered that the woman they had spared was not a typical woman in any way. She was the daughter of the governor, and she had been held hostage for the past few days at this point. The individual had previously requested money, but then suddenly severed all communication. It's likely that the woman won't make it through the night thanks to Jeff and Mike's quick thinking. The governor thanked the young guys and gave each of them a hefty check for their heroic actions in rescuing his daughter. Jeff and Mike were both still in shock at what had happened. They found it hard to comprehend that this was actually taking place to them.